Mick Ryan is a retired Major General in the Australian Army, a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the US Marine Corps University Command and Staff College and School of Advanced Warfighting. He has commanded at platoon, squadron, regiment, task force, and brigade level. In January 2018, he assumed command of the Australian Defence College in Canberra, Australia. In 2021, he was adjunct scholar at the Modern War Institute, and he's completed a 35-year career with the Australian Army and transitioned to the Army Reserve as a Major General on February 27th, 2022. Now, we'll put links to his books because they are definitely worth reading. His book War Transformers, published in 2022, White Sun War, The Campaign for Taiwan, published in 2023, and his latest book, The War for Ukraine, Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire. If I got this correct, that was 2024, but I may not have got that correct, so you can correct me there. Please do, if you like this video, make sure you press the like button at the end. Ensure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of the fantastic speakers we have on Silicon Curtain. And please do also check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It's incredibly important to help Ukrainians remain resilient at this time. Mick, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you back for the second time.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you again. Thank you for having me on.
Fantastic. And that last book, did I get the publishing year right? Has that come out this year or was that last year?
No, it's just come out in August this year. The War for Ukraine Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire, published by US Naval Institute Press.
Fantastic. I have to be completely honest with you because the channel's all about honesty. I have not got my hands on a copy yet, but I will try my best to do that and consume it cover to cover as well. Let's start with,
No,
I think,
thank you. I'll just say up.
yeah, please.
I was just going to say up front, if you do buy it, I don't take any royalties from the book. All my royalties we go to Ukrainian crowdfunders and charities.
Well, that's fantastic. And that very much echoes what we said at the start. There's been a major downturn, actually, in the amount of funds that a range of Ukrainian charities receive. And of course, the need perhaps has never been greater. So that's fantastic to hear. Well, let's start with a question that was posed by one of my guests earlier this week, Jade McGlynn. She made the assertion that Western foreign policy is teetering on the edge of an epoch-defining failure. And that has both short-term consequences, of course, for Ukraine, but also long-term consequences. Do you share that view that we're at an absolutely pivotal moment and risk failure with the current strategies?
Absolutely. I have to say up front, I love Jade's work. I think she's a brilliant academic and she spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and I share her views on this and many other elements. And I recommend your listeners certainly read her work. I think that we are certainly teetering on the brink of a significant geopolitical failure by the West over Ukraine for some time now. I know I've been writing for at least a year. The strategy of the West, of NATO and the United States, has been a strategy for failure. This strategy of defending Ukraine for as long as it takes is a slogan. It's not a real strategy. And unless we are advocating for, planning for, and resourcing the defeat of Russia in Ukraine, we are on course for failure. There's winning and losing. There is no middle ground here. This isn't some primary school sports tournament where you can have non-competitive sports. If the West does not support Ukraine to win this war, Russia will be emboldened to target other countries in the region, and China and other countries will similarly be emboldened to aggressively, or even more aggressively, target their neighbours, as we're already seeing the Chinese do against places like Vietnam, Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, and other countries. So I fully share Jade's views, and unless there is a fundamental shift in strategy, we are heading towards a new era of darkness for Western democracies.
And you've written very eloquently about Taiwan. And of course, we haven't seen that kickoff fully yet, but that's not to say that won't happen as part of the sort of flow and process that we're on. When it comes to Xi, do you think he's manipulating Russia, using Russia as part of some larger game? Or actually is Putin the one here, not so much calling the shots, but driving various countries towards an outcome which, of course, only he knows. Perhaps he doesn't have a clear visual on this. My sense, however, is that whereas Xi might think World War III is something of an overreach, Putin perhaps could benefit from dragging more countries into the conflagration, not just in Ukraine, but the Middle East and around the world.
Well, I think there's a certain amount of mutual benefit in this. Clearly, Putin started a war that got away from him. He was the dog that caught the car. We expected a short campaign where he could cower the Ukrainians and NATO into doing what he wanted. He found out that all his assumptions related to Ukraine, its government, and NATO were wrong, and he's still stuck with this war that's been going for 3 years with no end in sight. Now, Xi, as a master manipulator, uh, sees this war to be generally to his benefit. He sees it as an opportunity, pragmatically, to get cheap energy from Russia. He sees it as a way for Europe and the Americans to be distracted from concerns in the Western Pacific, the same way we were all distracted by Iraq and Afghanistan from China's massive buildup. And he also sees it as an opportunity for Russia to be disempowered over the long term. At the end of the day, Russia, as a result of this war, is going to be poorer. It's going to be less influential in world affairs. And that is, to Xi's view, probably a good thing for China. Now, Xi hasn't jumped in boots and all into this war. He's still scared of America. He still understands that American military power, but importantly, economic power, can hurt China in ways that has not yet even begun to bite if China decides to fully throw its weight behind Russia. So he's kind of balancing, but on balance, China benefits the longer the war in the Ukraine goes on.
So Putin may have got the Ukrainians completely wrong. Their will to fight, their cohesion, their innovation. I mean, there are many things he's clearly got wrong about that. There are perhaps many of those lessons he still hasn't learned either, because perhaps he sees the hand of NATO and America behind Ukrainian strength and not the strength that they hold within themselves and their culture. But he hasn't got the West wrong, has he? He hasn't got our reactions wrong. And in that sense, his calculations seems to be based on a fairly good assessment that we lack the will and conviction to really project our values and use, the ultimate power of that, which is force.
Yeah, I think in the short term he got us wrong, but in the long term his base instincts were probably correct that Western publics no longer have any patience. Most people in the West operate on 24-hour cycles. Anything next week is not worth thinking about. Anything next year doesn't even exist in most people's minds, and therefore it doesn't exist in the minds of our politicians, who, unlike a generation or two ago, were worldly, generally broadly experienced. Many of them had experience in war, either in government or as soldiers. This current generation of politicians have done nothing but politics. They know nothing but the campaign. They are poor governors, and frankly, would much rather follow the views of the populace rather than lead them. So I think both Xi and Putin understand this very well. It's why they've been able to very cheaply and easily manipulate the electoral cycles in the West, not just in the United States, where they found it so easy to buy people in the infosphere, but also in Europe, where we saw the most recent elections in Germany, where, the far right wing was essentially able to gain more power in that part of the country. So, I think their current views of the West are probably accurate. And if we continue down this track, at the end of this century, there will be no West.
That is obviously alarming, and I read with absolute fascination some of your recent posts, both on your Substack and, of course, on LinkedIn as well. And this idea that there is a problem in mobilizing a population in the 21st century, there is a problem in fighting total war, not just because of the complex technologies and the complex interconnected economies. That's the sort of rational view here. But we have a more fundamental problem, don't we? In that in the age of fragmented culture, it's difficult to actually get an entire population to align behind a single set of values and indeed see those values as higher than their lives, let alone their comforts, and these kind of things. Now, Ukraine has some of these issues. We seem to have those issues in a greater extent. It's almost inconceivable that something like the Second World War and the mobilization that took place in Britain, for instance, and then the subsequent effort to retake Europe, it's almost inconceivable that we have the will and capacity to repeat something like that now.
Well, I think it all comes down to, is there a perception of threat? I mean, the perception of an existential threat certainly drove the British response in the Second World War to the Nazis. 1939-40, the phony war. But from 1940, once the Battle of Britain kicked off, the British people understood there was a profound threat to the future existence of their nation. And the country rallied around and went through enormous hardship, not just through to the end of the Second World War, but beyond the end of the Second World War for probably a decade afterwards to destroy fascism in Europe. That kind of perception of threat to our systems does not exist. And if it does, which I think it does actually, politicians either don't understand it or lack the moral courage to have these very difficult conversations with their populations. They would much rather invest in winning votes through social systems rather than to have a balanced approach between prosperity and security. And I think unless that changes, we are heading for some fairly bleak times ahead.
And in the context of North Korean troops apparently already appearing in Kursk, and there are reports that some may have already been killed in trying to retake that chunk of Russian territory, which Ukraine took a number of months ago. But has it surprised you? Not necessarily that North Koreans are there, that should be shocking enough, but the weak response, not just of the political class, but in the media as well. I mean, it seems to me that 2 decades ago, people would have lost their minds at the very idea of a North Korean army on European soil. Now it seems to register barely a whimper.
Well, I think that's why the North Koreans have done it, because they understand that the West won't do anything about it. I think this, once again, is an indication that the authoritarian quad of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran no longer believe the West is capable of standing up against their coercive and aggressive actions. So I think that's a large part of why North Korea have done it, because they know they'll get away with it. The opportunity is far greater than the costs, because they'll learn about modern war. They will have a gracious client state, Russia, who will probably provide them with foreign currency and new technologies out of this. So this is all upside for North Korea. Kim, in his assessment, will have gone, well, what's the downside? America's not going to do anything. Biden's done. It doesn't really matter who's going to be the next US president. They're going to be more inwards looking. Europe's not going to act by itself. So why shouldn't I do this? And he's probably right in that, unfortunately.
And of course, the focus has been on the fact are there 10,000? Are there not? Are they elite so-called troops or not? But as a Russian guest on this channel pointed out, what's the point of a single tranche of 10,000 troops? Surely, if there's no pushback from the West, then you could be seeing 10 to 15,000 a month, because surely North Korea has many, many millions of impoverished soldiers in barracks. It's tricky feeding them all. There's nothing for them to do. This provides focus, potentially food, and also welcome income from the regime, because, of course, North Korea is going to be paid for these troops. It's going to receive not just technology, but key materials and resources from Russia.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is not entirely ideological. There's a pragmatic outcome. But, I agree, a 10,000 one and done will not have a significant impact on the trajectory of the war, but it will have an impact on the relationship between China and Korea to build on their provision of munitions, the provision of reconstruction workers in the Donbass and Siberia. It all kind of adds up. But on top of that, if North Korea was to sustain the throughput of soldiers from North Korea to Ukraine, I mean, even 5,000 a month would significantly help the Russian war effort. And that would probably be very doable for a North Korean army that is measured in 1 million plus soldiers. 5,000 a month is pocket change for the North Korean leader. It's 5,000 people he doesn't have to feed. It's 5,000 people he's being paid for. And the payoff in lessons in technology are more than worth the lives that President Kim does not care anything about. So we could well see further deployments of Korean troops. I mean, the Pentagon this morning has confirmed it's not 3,000, it's 10,000. It will be interesting to watch whether there will be subsequent deployments. If I was a betting person, I think I'd give you odds that is likely to be more on the way.
And of course, I mean, the North Korean leader doesn't care if these troops come back or not. In fact, judging by the way Russia throws its troops into the grinder, it seems quite happy if convicts return to the motherland. But those who are the non-convicts, the conscripts and the draftees, they tend not to make it out of what essentially has become a neo-Stalinist gulag in plain sight. I rather expect these North Korean troops are neither wanted back nor will be returning back.
Yeah, it's certainly a way for the North Koreans to get rid of what they consider as non-desirables, and 5,000, I don't know, convicts or people who are politically unreliable every month would probably be seen as another element of the bargain that North Korea is getting this. Remember, the Russians use Chechen soldiers behind the front lines to ensure these people can't run away. You either run towards the enemy and get shot, or run towards the rear and get shot. It's just how the Russians treat humans. I mean, they don't see people as humans like we do. So, once again, North Korea, this is all upside for them. There are very few downsides unless the United States and NATO decide to make them pay. There is absolutely zero indication of that at this point in time.
And what impact could this have on Kursk? Because for the last couple of months, it seemed that Kursk was a rather interesting and judging on who you listened to, some thought it was a red herring, some thought it was a stroke of absolute genius. But you've been paying a lot of attention to the ebbs and flows of the Kursk campaign. What's your assessment on the impact of North Korean troops and the way the Kursk incursion is going even before their arrival?
Well, weight and numbers still matters. I know there's a lot of people who think the future of war is about drones. The future of war is partially about drones, but ultimately war is about human beings. And the weight of numbers has made a difference in many bits of the battlefield. If you have a look at eastern Ukraine, the weight of firepower, be it through glide bombs or artillery, plus weight of numbers just constantly attacking and wearing down the smaller number of Ukrainians has led to these advances the Russians have taken, albeit at very high cost in human beings. And they will do exactly the same in Kursk. They've already started, there are dozens, if not 100 or 200 glide bomb attacks a day there. They will slowly but surely increase the numbers of soldiers there. And they will begin to wear down the Ukrainians. Now, they're trying to do as much as possible before the US election because they want whoever wins that election to make a judgment that it is inevitable that Russia will win. And they want a future US president to think they're doing Ukraine a favor by forcing them into some negotiated ceasefire. That is not the case. That is absolutely wrong. It's not doing them a favor. But that is how they want to condition Harris or Trump, regardless of who wins the election in the United States. And they also know that a lot of Americans have lost patience with the war in Ukraine, don't want any more American resources to go towards a war, and they want to fan that fire as much as they possibly can. And the way they do it is taking more ground in Ukraine and in Kursk.
Let's turn back to the election in a second. Before we do, I wanted to tackle that idea of drone warfare, and of course, what's happening in Ukraine. There is the mobile warfare in Kursk, where Ukrainians are trying to sort of reset the dynamic. But when it comes to the Eastern Front, the Southern Front, and the rest of the front on Ukrainian territory, that is a slow attritional war with characteristics of the First World War, with trenches which are now sort of waterlogged and about to freeze over, with rats and all the horrors that anyone who studied the First World War would be familiar with. But it's combined with high-tech warfare of drones and EW rather. But does the not just the sort of NATO training doctrine, but the kind of training that Ukrainian troops are receiving from NATO countries when they come to countries like Britain, does that training in any way reflect the reality of the war that they're facing, both trench warfare, attritional warfare, Russia's zombie meat wave attacks, but all this also this extraordinary scaling, testing, iteration of drone warfare, which is moving in month on month, is changing its character continuously.
Yeah, I mean, every war is an aggregation of things that have gone before it. Most wars are 90% the last war and 10% new stuff. And that's been particularly since the first industrial revolution, since the 1800s, that has been the case. If you have a look at the US Civil War, trench warfare was a thing in the last year or two of it. If you have a look at World War II, you look at the Korean War, Vietnam War, the war in the Donbass before the large-scale invasion. Trench warfare has featured in all those things. So, there's an over-fascination with soldiers in trenches when that has been the case in every single war fought in the last 200 years. It's not special to World War I or to this war. Um, there are things from previous wars, whether it's armored warfare, combined arms, the integration of air-land operations, good leadership, good tactics, that are also continuity, not new things in this war. But when we look at the new things in this war, I think there are three things that really stand out, which I characterize as a transformative trinity first, and the obvious one, which a lot of people like to go straight to, is the use of drones. Now, I'll make something very clear. Drones do not replace any capability. They complement every capability. So they make everything on the battlefield more effective or less effective, depending on who's using it. And they do that across air, ground, and maritime environments. And there has been a Cambrian explosion in the forms, the technologies, and the missions of these things. The second, I think, transformative element is this meshing or the integration of civil and military intelligence and sensors. This use of open source intelligence has exploded during this war, and it is, once again, it's got a feedback loop with the use of drones. And the third really transformative element, which has gone well beyond any Western military, is the democratization of digitized command and control systems, whether it's Kropiva, Delta, these kind of things that are down to each individual soldier in the Ukrainian military, which is not the vision for digitized command and control that the US, Australia, Britain, and others had. These three interact and reinforce each other. It is this transformative trinity that is changing the character of war, not just one of them by themselves. So wars are about continuity, but they're also about a bit of change. And the way that change happens is good leaders nurturing learning and adaptation at every level of the war. And we've seen that on both sides in this conflict.
Well, let's turn to the election because that is one of the big sort of existential elephants in the room. We've got Trump versus Harris. From a Ukrainian perspective, there may not be such a huge difference between these two as many perhaps think. One is a swift cutting off of aid, one is a slow incremental death by 1,000 cuts, or at least that's how some Ukrainians perhaps see it. But what are we likely to see in a Trump presidency? Is it likely to result in almost instant paralysis of institutions like NATO and so on, or disengagement? And indeed, to de-Trump NATO, what steps would need to be taken, possibly up to the role of Supreme Commander, perhaps being split between sort of US and European leadership?
Well, predicting the future is always fraught because the reality is you can't predict the future. There's a range of different possibilities, and even the most experienced political experts in the United States don't actually know what Trump is going to do. So I think we need to start with that caveat. I go back to the presidential debate between Harris and Trump when they were both asked, do you want Ukraine to win? Neither answered that question. Trump copped a lot of flack for it, for not saying so, and he should have. But Kamala Harris was given a free pass on that. But she did not answer that question either. So neither side of US politics have a clear vision for the future of this war. They can't even say, we want Ukraine to win. They're more scared of Russia losing than Ukraine losing. And that is a terrible place for NATO and the United States to be at this point in time. So until the strategic mindset changes, until there's an acceptance that Russia has to lose for there to be security in Europe, it's almost impossible to predict what might happen after the inauguration of a new US administration, given there are so many other factors impacting their thinking on Ukraine, whether it's China's actions in the Pacific, whether it's Israel and the Middle East, or something that we haven't seen yet that could emerge and also have an impact on the US and NATO calculus for the future of the war in Ukraine.
And of course, if you look at the whole plethora of YouTube experts that have sprung up, I include myself in that. There is a certain tendency to focus on economic challenges in Russia. Sometimes those can be comical. Sometimes those can give cause to think that this might Russia might implode. This might all be over. And one could perhaps classify that as wishful thinking. However, Trump has made statements about sanctions, and he seems to communicate the idea that he doesn't understand sanctions. He doesn't think sanctions are a good tool. And there is certainly the potential that, given that he is very money oriented, he may seek to lift sanctions. If that was the case, wouldn't we lose one of the absolutely critical levers to try and drive Russia towards some kind of defeat or disengagement from this disastrous war?
Yeah, I'm no economic expert. I'll state that right up front. I'm a scholar of war and military affairs. I can do my household budget. So I'm not going to jump into the economic pool like many others have. And I think the vast majority of people who are talking about the economic elements of this war know as much as I do. But there are some really great people out there who've studied economics for decades, who've made thoughtful contributions on taxes, on sanctions, and the other economic elements of war that, I'd recommend people seek out and read. Now, obviously, sanctions have had an impact on Russia. It's forced them to reorient its exports. It's forced them to reorient its international relationships. But, even if they are really effective, economic sanctions are not a silver bullet. There is nothing in war that is a silver bullet. There's no such thing. This notion of a wonder weapon that by itself is going to change the entire trajectory of the war is a fantasy. It's a fantasy, unfortunately, that every generation likes to indulge, but nonetheless, it's a fantasy. And it is only through the integrated of all elements of national power, including military, economic, information, diplomatic, social, and a range of other things, that you give yourself the best chance of winning a war. Focusing on just one or two, you're probably behind the eight ball and getting further behind as time goes on.
Now, I see in quite a few of your comments. I know we're heading towards the end, and I've got a couple of questions to still fire at you. But one that I repeatedly find fascinating, because this is where I'm not a historian of sort of military tactics and so on, but the idea of deterrence, which seemed to keep a balance during the Cold War, has this idea of nuclear weapons as a deterrent force, has that essentially now broken down? Because we see Putin committing all sorts of crimes on an absolutely extraordinary scale, and engaging in sabotage, hybrid aggression, all these kind of things, and it goes barely challenged, which sort of suggests that this nuclear umbrella concept is no longer any kind of deterrent, not just to a nuclear conflict, but to any level of sub-conflict beneath that, as far as Russia's concerned.
I think there's a couple of issues here. I think this war has proven that nuclear deterrence actually does work. I think it's worked very well from both perspectives. I think NATO's approach to nuclear deterrence has deterred Russia from broadening the war beyond Ukraine. There's absolutely no doubt that it knows that if it was to intervene in a NATO country, it would be a very different kettle of fish. But Russia's nuclear deterrent has deterred NATO from boots on the ground or closing the skies over Ukraine. That I think makes a whole lot of sense. I think it is the idea of conventional deterrence that has broken down here. And I think that we need to reinvest thinking about conventional deterrence in Europe and the Pacific, because I think too much conversation when we talk about deterrence focuses purely on nuclear. But what about the conventional side? For example, what does a theory of conventional deterrence look like for a middle power without nuclear weapons? I don't know. I know Australia's new national defence strategy is based on deterrence by denial, but that's not a clear 21st century conventional deterrence theory or strategy, I don't think. So I think nuclear deterrence has held and has worked. It's conventional deterrence that we really need to think through. When I look at my region, when it comes to nuclear deterrent, I have three large authoritarian powers that are nuclear armed: North Korea, Russia, and China, who are players in the Western Pacific, and no country in the Western Alliance who are, with the exception of the United States, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, none of whom are nuclear armed. They have to rely on the nuclear extended deterrent provided by the United States. The real problem is, do those countries trust the United States in both the nuclear and conventional deterrence regime? Now, I think that's an open question at the moment, and I think that's why you see the Republic of Korea and Japan having speculated on nuclear weapons in their armories in future, because there's sufficient doubt that the extended nuclear deterrent of the United States might work to deter a Chinese grab for Taiwan or the Senkakus or something like this.
Could, in that respect, South Korea see the involvement of North Korea in Europe as very much part of its business, and an extension of its own conflict with North Korea? Would the US in that case implore them not to get involved? And of course, from Ukraine's point of view, having South Korean boots on the ground, having South Korean artillery at scale, shells and so on, would be, I would have thought, extremely welcome at this point.
Well, I don't think we'll see South Korean boots on the ground, but certainly the provision of lethal aid is probably on the table now. For the duration of the war, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, has provided non-lethal assistance to Ukraine, but will not provide direct lethal assistance. It's been happy to provide munitions to the US, so to allow the US to then provide its munitions to Ukraine. But potentially you could see the Koreans, who produce large numbers of excellent main battle tanks, self-propelled artillery, providing these and munitions and other systems. They have their own version of HIMARS, and other excellent weapon systems. I mean, this is truly a world-class defence industry that builds at a scale no European country has for a generation. So I think we could see this assistance on its way to Korea. Remember, the Koreans are providing a huge amount of equipment to Poland. So there's already a strategic logistic base for a lot of this stuff in Poland if the Republic of Korea decides to dispatch military assistance to Ukraine in the short term. But I don't think boots on the ground would be part of that calculus for the South Korean government.
Well, the very last question just links up to something you said a minute ago about the idea of nuclear deterrence and this sort of indeterminism as to whether conventional and nuclear umbrella from the US is really robust enough at this point. And of course, with the election, there's all sorts of stuff up in the air. Given that background, Zelensky has come up with almost like, not an ultimatum, but a kind of shock tactic to say, look, Ukraine either needs nukes or NATO. I would perhaps argue that actually they need both at this point, because neither on their own perhaps can give them the kind of not just security they want, but I think one of my guests put it like this: that nukes and NATO would mean that they were taken off the menu and given a seat at the table, whereas at the moment they feel somewhat exposed.
Yeah, I thought it was a very interesting comment by Zelensky, and I fully understand why he would. His country is at the threat of being extinguished by Russia. And in that situation, you must consider every potential strategic response to that. And nuclear weapons has to be something that the Ukrainian government has to consider. Now, if they were to develop an independent nuclear deterrent, and at the end of the day, why shouldn't they? I know there's a non-proliferation treaty and a whole range of things, but the UK's got it, France has got it, the US has got it, Israel's got it, and others. If Ukraine was to do it, they wouldn't need a lot of nuclear weapons, and they could also potentially offer a nuclear deterrent umbrella over countries that have supported him in this war, particularly the Baltics, Poland, and maybe a couple of others. So, I think there's a few interesting wrinkles here. But, developing a nuclear weapon comes with very profound international regulatory problems, very significant financial challenges, and command and control issues as well. So it's not a small undertaking. But if they were to do it, I think that would potentially change the calculus of the Russians. I mean, after all, they were the ones who wanted those nuclear weapons back at the end of the Cold War.
Yes, and now we can sort of guess perhaps why they were so desperate for that. And of course, Ukraine
Correct.
does have a substantial civil nuclear industry, so they're already one step closer towards doing that, closer than say Poland that doesn't have nuclear reactors at that scale, or even any, as far as I know.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and also they're extraordinarily inventive and creative. Now, during the Cold War, the warheads on the missiles the Ukrainians built, which still deployed by the Russian strategic forces, the nuclear warheads were developed and controlled by Russia itself. But still, I mean, the science is not that complicated anymore. It's actually the engineering and the testing that's very complicated, as well as the international regulatory regime.
Mick, it's been an absolute delight speaking to you as always. I hope to repeat the experience again, and of course, things are moving incredibly fast in this war. But for today, thank you so much for spending so much time sharing your insights with the audience.
Thank you. It's been great to be with you again. I look forward to talking again soon.